And now they're not going to hear that wonderful welcome that I just gave them.
Yes, you can say it really quickly again if you really want. I just pressed the recording button. Sorry about that.
I suppose I could have remembered to press a record button too. But I just, for the recording, I want to say how thankful we are to have new faces here and new emails and people on our JResponse peer community as our listserv has gotten that much bigger. And we say a mazel tov, a congratulations to all of those that just graduated yesterday from our JResponse Canadian program. So we have a lot happening today. I want to start with a quick whip, especially as we have new faces. And I may have done this one for us before, but it's always one of my favorites because I always need ideas of what I'm going to make for dinner. So as it's Hanukkah and as we are celebrating the holidays and Hanukkah is all about frying our food, what's your favorite fried food? And we're going to start with Tara, Sam, and Stephanie.
Not Hanukkah.
I would say
when
French
it's not
fries.
Hanukkah, I'd have to. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. French fries. All the time.
I was gonna say when it's not Hanukkah, obviously, I'd have to go mozzarella stick.
Ooh. Okay, Sam?
Can you hear me okay? Is my
Yes.
audio? Yeah. All right. I would absolutely say mozzarella sticks. That's an easy. Like the fun, like fair, like fried Oreo, fried Snickers stuff is cool, but like my everyday is fried mozzarella stick.
Okay. Willis, Kathleen, and then Mark.
I'm originally from the Midwest, so I'm gonna go with fried cheese curds.
I feel like it's a little bit obvious, but the Kentucky girl prefers fried chicken.
I'm gonna be a little bit like Kathleen, chicken wings, 100% chicken wings.
Okay. Risa, we are going through and giving our favorite fried food in honor of me needing to come up with dinner and it being Hanukkah. So we'll go with you and then Amy and Jody.
That's a tough one. There's so many to choose from. How about chicken fried steak?
I like it. Amy and then Jody?
I'd have to say chicken.
My favorite fried food is something that you could get at carnivals, and that's all those vegetables that I never eat, only like twice a year, but I go right for it when I go to a carnival or a fair.
Love it. Steve, Sierra, and then Jesse?
Funnel cake. I mean, it's a classic. Can't go wrong with funnel cake. And listen, it's Hanukkah, you're celebrating, so eat it for dinner.
Yes.
For me, it's got to be sweet potato fries.
Okay, I like that. Jesse?
I do not discriminate. I love all fried food. Because it's Hanukkah, I treated myself to some fried pickles yesterday that were quite delicious.
Nice. I don't know if I've ever partaken in a fried pickle, but I may have to. I would say mine is Brussels sprouts. I like them with like all the the little bit of almond and craisins and some of the young kosher stuff too. But I think that's my favorite. So thank you. I'm sure my kids will be excited to know that it is French fries and mozzarella sticks for dinner with a side of funnel cake. And everyone in my house should be really happy. I want to get us started today and talk a little bit about another face that's on this screen today and why Sierra Weiss is here with us. She is the Access and Inclusion Specialist for the JCC community. But I want to talk a little bit about how this came about and why Sierra is sitting here with us. When Mark started the Last 1080 program and was going through the program with all of the new responders, new J responders, they were asking questions, and they were asking about how is this look in the lens of inclusion, and how do we make sure that we're being cognizant and thoughtful of everyone around us, and even, you know, of those with special or different needs from what that general population may be. And so Mark and Jesse and I were talking and just thought that was such a new perspective that we hadn't thought about, as we've thought about the program so many times. And it became something that we all wanted to learn more about and really take that focus from what our normal JResponse lens is, and be able to put that extra lens on it and really broaden how we're viewing everything. So this is twofold. One, if you guys have something, if you have an idea of something you want to learn more about, focus on, you know, is there a miss or a success that we've had that we want to explore more, let us know. That's why we meet. That's why we get together as a peer community, is to expand our knowledge and everything else. So that, and we're just so fortunate that Sierra is here with us. I did include her bio, but you know, she was most recently with the Israel's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Previous was with the Rudderman Family Foundation. She has a master's degree in bioethics from Emory University, where she also completed her bachelor's degree in, I'm amazed every time I read this, interdisciplinary studies with a focus in disability studies and bioethics. It's a mouthful, but we're so happy to have you here with us, and we're just excited to learn alongside each other and you today.
Thank you, Jess. I am so happy to be here. I'm really glad you guys reached out and invited me to be with you all today because, oh, can I have access to share my screen? I was trying to be really cool there and share it while I was talking. Okay. So this is a topic I've been thinking about for a while, really ever since I joined the team and learned about Mark's work with JResponse. I was always very interested in learning more about readiness and emergency preparedness for specifically for people with disabilities. And it's something that's been on my mind for a long time. So I was really glad to have this opportunity, which really inspired me to do a lot more research and reading and understanding that I'm excited to share with all of you. But what I really want this to be is a conversation. So I'm going to share a bit about myself and my background and kind of give an overview for our conversation today. I'm going to spend a little bit of time sharing about JCC Association's 8 inclusion guiding principles, which I hope will guide our conversation in some of the work and thought around being prepared for emergency situations in an inclusive way. And then we'll talk more about that emergency preparedness, and then I'd love to open it up for discussion. And I'd also welcome any of you, if you have thoughts or examples that you want to share that feel relevant to what I'm discussing at any point in the presentation, feel free to just unmute or pop it in the chat. I do really want this to be interactive. So Jess gave a very lovely background and overview of who I am and what I do, but just to share a little bit more about the work I do with JCC Association and with the movement. I work kind of in 2 main areas within the realm of inclusion. A big part of that is professional development and trainings, which is like what I'm doing now, and also creating materials and resources that professionals in the field can use in their everyday work, whether they're an inclusion professional or any other professional in the JCC movement. One of my overarching goals is really to make sure that every JCC professional feels that they are an inclusion professional professional to some capacity, it's really important for me to have everyone understand that inclusion is a part of the work that they do. And while you might not be working directly with people with disabilities in your day-to-day, bringing inclusive values and the mindset of inclusion into your work will better the outcomes for everyone involved and also make the community stronger. And I just do want to clarify for today and in the work that I'm doing, the inclusion that I'm talking about isn't the inclusion of people with disabilities. And I think that's just important to name, but it also hopefully will be clear that the values that underlie this work really apply more broadly to inclusive practices in all its forms. So to start us off, the 8 Guiding Principles on Inclusion was really one of the first projects that I took on when I started in this role just over 2.5 years ago now. And we felt that it was really important in starting this role, which was a new role for JCC Association, to create a foundation and shared language to discuss inclusion in the field. And of course, rooted in Jewish values, as you'll see as I go through the guiding principles, we really wanted to make sure that these principles were a reflection of the work that's already going on in the field, and also values that will inspire a continued evolution towards more inclusive practices within our communities. And we worked with a variety of professionals throughout the field, both internal to the JCC movement and external, as well as people with lived experience of disability, to make sure that their experiences are reflected in the values that we developed. And I just want to take a moment before I dive into the guiding principles to share ways that after this presentation, I'm not expecting you to remember all of these principles off the top of your head. There will not be a test at the end, but there are lots of different ways to access them and engage with them beyond the conversation we'll have today. And I'll make sure that I send this presentation to all of you so you can access and actually click this link. But we have a page on the JCC Resource Center dedicated to these guiding principles. You can find a one-pager that has all of the principles, as well as a webinar series that we did over the course of 8 months, where we highlighted each of the guiding principles. There are 8 in total, through a webinar series that delve deeper into each of the principles in hour-long conversations with professionals in the field and external to the field to go through tools to really incorporate each of the principles into your JCC and your practices. And we also, and this was just launched really this week, is a beautiful poster series, which you can get a little glimpse of on the screen here. We worked with an incredible artist to create posters that accompany each of the guiding principles as another way to engage with and access these guiding principles. And we are encouraging JCCs to share them in their communities and their centers to showcase a commitment to inclusion and the values that we've developed. So if this is of interest to you, happy to chat offline about this project. So as I go through the guiding principles, and you can also see here another sneak peek of the poster series, as I go through the guiding principles, I want to encourage all of you to think about which most resonates with inclusive emergency preparedness, which will take some time to discuss. So I just want you to think about what stands out and why, and this is a question we'll come back to later in our discussion portion. And if anything stands out to you immediately, feel free to put it in the chat or jot it down, because we'll have an opportunity to discuss this later in the presentation. So the first principle, which I always like to start with, is shlemut, wholeness. People with disabilities are whole people who do not need to be cured or fixed. We view disability as a rich and essential part of human diversity. And I like to start here because I think it's a really important foundation principle, just recognizing and naming that, we shouldn't think of someone who has a disability as lesser than because of that disability, or that they need to be fixed in order to be included in our community. They are who they are, and that is really important to our community and its diversity, to recognize each person as their authentic selves as they are. The next principle is B'Tselem Elohim, inherent worth. We respect the inherent dignity and autonomy of each person. We value people because of who they are, not because of how much they produce or accomplish. Each person has something to learn, something to teach, and something to contribute to community. And building on the principle of wholeness, this concept of inherent worth is really important as we think of each person in our community, that they are valuable, that they bring something into our community, and we have something we can learn from each and every person in our community, which I think is really important to take with us as we're thinking about JResponse and that preparedness. R.E.A.D.Y, interdependence. No one is entirely independent. Every person is dependent on others in one way or another. Each person functions differently depending on context or environment. And again, I think this is something that we see so clearly in our JCC communities. I think it's very specific in a lot of ways to Western culture, this idea that people, grow up and leave their family home and potentially go to college or get a job, get married, do all these things, which we label as gaining independence, no longer relying on others. But as we know, as our work as JCC professionals, we are so dependent on one another. We need one another to survive and to find community. And our communities are built on this idea of being dependent on one another. And this is true as well for people with disabilities. And it's not a negative thing, but it's something, as we all know, that's so enriching to our lives to rely on one another. Negashut, accessibility. We are deliberate and mindful about the environment we shape. As our tradition teaches, you shall not insult the deaf or place a stumbling block before the blind. Starting from where we are, we look at how we can shift our policies, communications, programs, processes, and facilities to increase and enhance accessibility to JCCs and their programs, and Ein Sof. We do not finish. We always strive to become more accessible. And I think this is a really important framework for accessibility, not just that we should create spaces and environments that are mindful in the way that they include people with disabilities or various needs or backgrounds or interests, but also that we do not finish, that we're constantly reevaluating these practices and ensuring that they are matching the evolving needs of our community and the people within it. And I think that is particularly important as we have conversations about emergency preparedness, thinking constantly about evolving our practices to include a changing or growing population and making sure that we are continuously thinking about how we could be more inclusive in those practices. Al Pitracho, inclusive education, building upon Proverbs 22:6, teach children according to their way. JCCs offer children, families, and people of all ages inclusive programs that meet their individual learning needs. And I'll talk about this a little bit more when I get more into the emergency response part of the conversation. But I think that this is a really good way of thinking about being prepared for different people's needs, of adjusting, and we can extrapolate from teaching, but learning from people what their needs are and how we can best serve them when it comes to creating a plan that will make them feel empowered and prepared for any situation. Savivat Avodah Tova, positive work environment, plan for and accommodate staff access needs from the initial recruitment process to the day-to-day work environment of employees. And this is one I always like to highlight with our JCC professionals, because I think so often we spend so much of our time serving others, making sure we are doing the absolute best for our community, for the constituents within it. And we don't always take the time to look internally and think about how we are doing those practices for ourselves, for our colleagues, for our staff. And I just think it's important to highlight in the context of all conversations we have within our JCC movement, that we also need to make sure that the values and the work that we are putting out to our community is also reflected internally within our organization. And finally, tzedek, justice. We view inclusion as the work of tzedek, justice, rather than tzedakah, charity, because ableism is intertwined with other systemic barriers. We draw on an intersectional approach to undertaking this work. Efforts to remove barriers to full participation are acts of tikkun olam, repair of the world, and should center people with disabilities as contributors and leaders in these endeavors. And we'll take some time today to talk about the barriers and ways that we can remove them to make sure we are doing our part in this act of tikkun olam, to make sure that we are including people with disabilities in our plans and endeavors. So, turning our attention now more to the themes of JResponse, And I also want to give, sort of a disclosure that this is not my particular area of expertise within the work of inclusion, but I think that there is a lot of content both rooted in the guiding principles and the values that we can learn from them, but also in a lot of available research that I spent some time reviewing related to emergency preparedness for people with disabilities. I spent some time considering the different ways we do inclusion within our JCCs and how we can best prepare. And I've kind of taken some of the work that's been highlighted online and in different resources that I'll share as well to narrow them down to the work that we're all doing in our JCCs, and hopefully offer some questions and food for thought that we can discuss in taking those first steps to make sure that our plans are inclusive as we're thinking about the preparations we need to make for emergency situations. So, excuse me. So there are really two main routes to preparedness. One is planning for specific programming serving people with disabilities within your JCC. So if you have a inclusion program, an inclusive preschool classroom, day programs, this is really the main route you'll want to take to make sure you are taking those actions to be prepared. And then the more general preparedness necessary for serving a more diverse community. And this is something probably everyone on this call will want to consider. We all have vastly diverse communities that we are a part of. So whether or not you have a specific program for people with disabilities within your community, you will want to consider ways that your JCC includes different people and what those needs might be so that you can be prepared no matter the situation. And I just want to take a moment. I know this is a model you're all probably familiar with, the R.E.A.D.Y model. Mark sent over some materials for me to review so I could get a better understanding of JResponse, and this really stood out to me. And I think that as I was reading through these different aspects of the model, it felt really relevant to inclusive practices. And what I tried to show through this little image that I made, that if we infuse the R.E.A.D.Y model with inclusive practices, with these inclusion values, we will get out of them more positive outcomes, making sure that we are more prepared, that more people are served and protected in emergency situations. So, and I encourage anyone to jump in if they have specific programs within their JCCs that this feels relevant for. If you want to, we'll also have more opportunity for discussion. But I kind of thought through, if you have a specific program within your JCC that serves people with disabilities, some of the things that I think it would be important to think about as you're planning an emergency plan. So the first being awareness, knowing who are those vulnerable populations in your center? What are the programs? Who are the people involved in them? Is it specific for different disabilities on a wide spectrum? Is it for people with more specific types of disabilities? I know some JCCs that I've worked with have movement programs for people with Parkinson's, or day programs for adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities, or potentially wheelchair basketball, or different programs. So you'll want to be aware of what exactly those programs are, because something that is really important to be aware of, for better or for worse, disabilities cover a very wide spectrum. Sorry. It's not going to be a one size fits all. What works for people with one type of disability is not necessarily going to work for people with a different type of disability. And even within the same type of disability, people have various needs. So just being aware of who your populations are is going to be a really important place to start. Next, communication is, of course, key for being prepared. To know who are the key contact points for the programs at the JCC that serve people with disabilities, who is in charge, who is going to help communicate your plans to a potential vulnerable population within your JCC. And then through that relationship and having that open channel of communication, you can start to think about accessibility. What are the specific needs of this population? what do their disabilities mean to them? What sort of communication needs might they have that might be different than what you've planned for as you've thought about your community? What adjustments might you have to make? And this is where you'll really want to work in collaboration with whoever that person is or that program to create inclusive emergency plans. Like I said earlier, and this comes up in several of the guiding principles, including people with disabilities in the conversation is really important. Or if that's not a possibility for the particular population that you're working with within your JCC, a representative, a professional who knows the population very well, working together in collaboration will make sure that you have the best possible outcomes and are really meeting the needs of whoever the people are that you're trying to serve. And finally, practice. Conduct specific trainings with these programs to make sure that they are prepared. It will be important for populations of people with disabilities more than others. I'm so sorry. I don't know where this cough just came from. But it will be really important for these populations more than other people in your community to really practice and do trainings around preparedness to make sure that they understand routine is really important to a lot of different disabilities, and interruption to routine can be really alarming or complicated, bring out certain behaviors or symptoms. So making sure that you are taking the time to understand how these populations might react in an emergency situation will also help you better prepare and make sure that they are prepared for any situation that might come, that they know what to do. And once they feel like they have a routine around that, that will better serve them in, God forbid, if there's a situation that comes up. So then looking more towards the general practice, a lot of the methods are the same, but it will require a bit more of a blanket perspective because you might not know the specific needs of the community members. So this goes beyond having a specific program serving people with disabilities. This will be true for any JCC as you're thinking about your diverse community and what those different needs might be. So again, awareness, thinking about who might need extra support in your center during an emergency, whether maybe it's someone who has different physical capabilities, maybe has hearing loss or needs that sort of support. Maybe someone who doesn't speak English and you know that the announcements you have planned in a emergency situation are all going to be in English. Being aware of what those different language barriers might be is really important. And then again, moving to communication, what methods do you have in place to ensure that all members will be safe in case of an emergency? And if it's a matter of language barriers and you're aware that there's a large population in your community that maybe speaks a different language, this might mean making sure that all of your staff knows some basic phrases in another language, and just being aware of what those different needs are and what are some ways that you can prepare. So if you're in a situation, you have all your bases covered. And this might require, a bit of an assessment and really thinking through those different needs, or maybe appointing certain people to take on that responsibility, learning some of those few words in a different language if needed, or whatever those other needs might be, making sure that you have some trusted people who in a situation could go and help those who have physical limitations that might, make it more difficult for them to exit a building if they need, and making sure you have people that you can distribute in an emergency, or making sure that a few members of the staff or whoever might be over the PA system in an emergency gets those basic phrases down in a language that's common in your population. And of course, again, collaboration. Who can you work with both within your staff, like I just mentioned, but also potentially having, a task force of community members that represent the diversity of your population to make sure that their needs are met in an emergency situation. The best course of action, and this is very true specifically in the work of disability inclusion, of including people with disabilities in the conversation, but I think is also really important more broadly, bringing community members into this conversation and understanding their needs might be a really great step in ensuring that those needs are met. And again, practice, what tools can you give all of your staff members so they're prepared, and having them, you know, constantly refreshing and remembering those tactics. So if they're needed, they're fresh and ready to be used. And just kind of to draw it all together, and I took this word situational awareness from the JResponse materials that I read through, just on a broader level, knowing the needs of your JCC and the community, consider ways you can improve your emergency preparedness through the lens of inclusion. And I think that, you know, from inclusion, we can also learn flexibility and being accommodating. Not just people with disabilities have additional needs that might come up in an emergency situation or other situations that might come up. You want to infuse as much as you can the values and the practices of inclusion into that readiness model, into the work of JResponse, and not just as an afterthought, but actually as you're going through the process, take those steps to implement the improvements, because it won't just in the end benefit the people with disabilities who really do need that additional support, but it will also make your entire community more included in the program. It will give you the tools and the mindset to be accommodating and flexible to the different needs, and then therefore make sure that you're more prepared. And then, like I said earlier, regularly reviewing these practices to ensure that they reflect the constant evolution of your community and its needs is so important, because new people are coming into our communities all the time, new programs are starting, and making sure that you are up to date about what those are, what the needs of those new community members are, will also make sure that you in turn are more prepared. So I wanna take the time now to have some time for discussion. And Jess and Jesse, I'll let you all decide if we wanna do this in smaller breakout rooms or just as a group. But I do want to take some time to start thinking through some of these questions, especially with the lens of the inclusion guiding principles, and give you all some time to talk together and then share more with our larger group.
Why don't we separate into two groups and then come back together?
Perfect. That sounds great. And then I could just should be able to like broadcast the questions to everyone. Perfect. So these are the questions, and I could just take a moment to read through them before we break out. So are your current emergency preparedness practices inclusive? Consider ways you can use the inclusion guiding principles to improve the practices in place. And I took some of the bullet points from the principles that I think are most relevant on the next slide, which I will share after this. And then what first steps do you want to take to improve the practices for your community's needs? Okay. I'm going to pop this in the chat, which I think you'll still be able to see when we go into breakout rooms.
I think you should all copy what's in the chat, because it might not go to the breakout room. So someone can then just paste it when you're in your chat room.
Sounds good too. And I can also, I think I should be able to broadcast some questions once we're into the breakout rooms.
Sorry, I am.
Jess, are you putting into breakouts? Do you need support?
I did something weird. So if you could help me and do that.
Yep. All right. We have two breakout rooms. Sierra, you and Jess will be in one. And then where are you, Jesse? I don't see you. Oh, because you're the host. So yeah, Jesse, you and I are hosts. So go to room 2, Jesse, when you can, and I'll stay in the center and then I'll bounce back. It's 2:39. Should we do 10 minutes?
Exactly what I was thinking. Perfect.
All right. Thank you. See you shortly. Sierra, I'll go. In our group, we kind of did a little bit of all three questions. I know one thing we talked about was it was a couple of slides back. It was about communication, and I think we think about disabilities. It might target us to one certain type of disability, whether it's physical or psychological or what have you. But it might just even be in language, and not even different languages. English, Spanish, Hebrew, what have you. But also how do people understand what's happening and how you communicate that to them earlier or later. I was sharing the example that I have a son that gets behaviorally dysregulated when there's a fire drill that he didn't know about in advance. So obviously the emergency itself he might not know, but any way that there can be advanced preparation or something that if an individual has a plan that can be rolled up to a broader plan and that's included in readiness. I thought that was something that we chatted about.
Thanks for sharing that. Yeah, we talked a lot about communication too. I think that, when it comes to emergencies and planning ahead, that seems to be, one of the biggest challenges is finding communication methods for the various needs of community members. So we were talking about a few different ways, whether that's being aware of certain populations within your community that maybe speak a different language and making sure someone had the idea of like a handout that could go out to all the staff with a few phrases in the appropriate languages. So if a situation occurred that people could be prepared, or, very clear signage that directs you towards emergency exits that people can be made aware of in the case of an emergency. Does anyone else have anything they want to share before we wrap up from the discussions in the small groups?
It's your question, what first steps do you want to take to improve? And I'd love for you to give us some insight and maybe some additional resources that we could use for that.
Yes, gladly. Well, you perfectly are taking me to my last slide, which is amazingly, and this was a question we were talking about in our small group as well, like how do you prepare for all of the various needs of all the people in the community, especially if you don't know all of that information. And as I was doing my research for this presentation, I was planning on putting together some resources for all of you. And amazingly, I found that the CDC has already put one together that is very, very extensive and wonderful. And it's linked in this page, but they have a whole page dedicated to disability and health emergency preparedness. There are probably close to 100 different resources and tools in this page. For some reason, they are organized by state, the states that put them out, but I wouldn't only look at the state that you might be sitting in. All of the resources, I spend a lot of time looking through many of them, are really excellent. They break down preparedness in different emergency situations for different populations. And as I was reading through them, and I think this has been a true theme in our conversations here as well, something that I kept thinking about was that a lot of the ideas and suggestions that were given for various means of communication and planning and preparing for different populations of people with various disabilities also feels really relevant to just the diversity of our community population as well. A lot of ideas about ways to communicate in emergency situations, but also in preparation for them with community members with various communication or learning needs. So I really do encourage you all to spend some time looking through these toolkits and pulling out what feels relevant and appropriate for your community and your JCC, depending on the different programs, the size, the population, whatever it may be. There is a tool in here for everyone, and you can definitely pull from the various resources to infuse your plan within your community with inclusive practices that will strengthen your planning for emergency situations and also suit the needs of the members of your community. So unless anyone has any questions, I would love to end there, and I would love to ask all of you, as you are taking the resources from this conversation, from this website, from the inclusion guiding principles, I'd love to hear, whether it's through Mark, Jess, and Jesse, or directly, what changes you might make, what things you are doing in your community to make them more inclusive. I'd love to learn about the methods that you are taking on and practicing, so we can continue to also share them more broadly with JCC professionals, so other people can learn from the amazing work that you are all doing to be prepared within your communities. And I want to thank you all for this opportunity. I really appreciate spending some time with all of you and learning about the work that you're doing here.
Sierra, I'm going to jump in, Jess, if that's okay, just because Sierra and I are colleagues together. And thank you so much for agreeing to do this on relative short notice too, based on conversations that were just happening in Haney a couple of weeks ago. And to Jess and Jesse for your coordination. But Sierra, you have done such tremendous work for our field and for our movement for Jewish community in just the last couple of years. And for you to bring this to us, I think it's a lot of food for thought and a lot of things that we can advance over the next little time. And I guess we have a quiet group here. Anyone else wants to say any comments or questions to Sierra before we go? But thank you. This definitely advances our thinking around readiness. And I would say there's a little bit of every R and every other R, what I like to say a lot. So I see some of these 8 guiding principles, as well as some of your recommendations for relief and recovery. How do we speak to people post-trauma if they have certain abilities or disabilities? How does that play into account? What resilience strategies can they, or ought to elevate or not elevate for people with a whole sorts of abilities and backgrounds? So thank you, Sierra.
I want to chime in and also say thank you to Sierra, but I'm going to try and do it in 3 languages. I don't know if I can. I was thinking about this while Mark was talking. So, gracias, toda. So thank you so much, Sierra. We really appreciate everything that you have bestowed upon us today. I'm sure, I know I will be getting in touch with you about those posters. And I want to say once again, Mazel Tov to all our new JResponders. Happy Hanukkah, happy Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, Happy Solstice, whatever you celebrate. I hope it is fantastic. And we look forward to hearing from you, and you will hear from us in early 2024 with next steps on what's coming up with our peer group. So I wish everybody a wonderful whatever you're doing.
Happy holidays. Happy Hanukkah. Be well.